Hey, welcome to the sixth and final video of the URL Shortener with Laravel series. In this video, we're going to be finishing up the entire system, making the create and edit components, making all the tests pass, and kind of just buttoning everything up. Since the last video, I've actually changed a couple things just outside the series because I found some issues in the test, very small things, which I'll go over now. Starting off, I actually edited the PHP unit file, and I uncommented these two lines here. I noticed that the refresh database trait that we use at the top of the link test didn't actually refresh the database between tests, and I figured out that this is why. So the phpunit.xml file defines basically what your tests run in or how they run. And the next thing I fixed was actually inside the link test. This is a good example. I just wrapped these in bool val because for whatever reason sometimes these would return as 0 or 1 instead of true or false, and there were some issues there. It wasn't asserting that it's true even though it's a value of 1, and so just wrapping this in bool val finds the actual boolean value of it, and that was an easy fix. And the last thing I changed actually was the example test. So typically I delete this and because it's a pretty useless test, but in this case, in the last video, because we switched the main route to just a redirect to the login page, this test broke because it used to be like this. It was expecting a 200 status from the main route, and instead it got a redirect to the login page. So now I just changed this to login, and it obviously hitting the login page returns a 200, so this test passes. But usually I would just delete this. And that's pretty much all I did for the updates. You could see all of this in the GitHub repository, and we can now get started with the rest of the video. So I think just to get going, I actually had this idea. I wanted to put a create button right here. So this is our index page after we log in. You can see where our pagination is working. We set this all up in the last video, but I want a create button here because I feel like that'd be really useful if you want to just create something quickly. Currently, there's no actual way to get to the create page, so I feel like that'd be a good place to put a button. To do this, I actually just need to open up the index.blade.php. This is the file that basically slots in the Livewire component into the app.blade.php file. So this kind of like wraps that component and then slots it into the main template file. And so I want to put the button up here, which means that I need to justify between with this links label here, right? So the way I'm going to do this is just by wrapping this in a div and putting the link tag below it. Now I did copy this button actually from the included Breeze buttons because I thought it looked cool. The only downside is that there's a ton of classes associated with this button to make it look the way it does, so it might take me a while to type it out. And we want to go to the links.create. Okay, so there's our create button, and it's going to be justified between with the links label here, the H2, and item centered. So it's centered vertically, and so there's a lot of classes required to make the button look the way it does, and this is a great candidate for like a refactor and to pull these styles out into something that's reusable. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I think it's fine. Let's take a look at how this looks on the page. Links.create is not defined. Okay, so we actually need to add an S here. That's my mistake. And we can see that we have our create button here. If we click it, of course, nothing will come up because our component doesn't have anything in it, but at least it works and it goes to the correct route, which is a win. So we can now actually get started on creating the create component, which is very exciting. And then after that, we'll create the edit component because it actually relies heavily on the create one. So let's get started on that. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just open up, let's clear this, open up the create.blade.php file. In here we could see that we're just outputting the create link component for the Livewire component, and there's nothing around it, and that's why it doesn't look styled when we go to the create page. So just before I get started on the actual component, I want to make sure that this template is actually wrapping the Livewire component with the Laravel Breeze dashboard stuff. So the way we do this is basically the same as the index, and actually I might go ahead and just copy the index in here so we save some time. So let's do this. This is the index one, so we replace this with create link, and that's the correct Livewire component. And we can replace this with create. And we don't actually need this button, which means we also don't need this div here. And in here, we're just going to leave this as padding 6. And I believe that the rest of it's okay the way it is. So let's actually add some text within the create link template here for the component and see what that looks like when it's rendered. So let's go to the create page. Perfect, looks really great. So right in here, we're actually gonna shrink down this and we're gonna limit the width of it. And within there, we're gonna put our create form. So our create form is gonna be defined or built within this template file. We could just start with a form tag and make sure that we're binding to an actual method within the component, although we haven't actually built these methods yet. So I'm gonna bind to a save link method that I will create later on. And within this form, we want to just create a couple divs as holders for the different inputs. And on this page, it's only going to be a URL input and also a slug input. So it's relatively simple. Okay, so what I've done here is actually created the two text inputs that I need to get this done. So the first one's the URL and the other one's the slug. A couple things to note here is I'm using the X input component that comes with Breeze. And I'm just trying to reuse whatever components come with it just to reduce the time I need to develop stuff. Although there's really not that much being reused from here, like I'm still adding my own classes to it. I added block, margin top and bottom of 2 and also full width to it. And on the URL one, I've actually also added required because URL is required and autofocus. I want the cursor to automatically be set on this form field. For the slug, I actually didn't add the required or autofocus because I put autofocus up here and the slug's not actually required. So if it's not entered, it will be automatically generated on the back end. Okay, so what I've done down here is actually create two buttons. One to reset the form, which is this button here, and one to submit the form. One tricky thing to note about Livewire is that the wire submit prevent you define up here, so in our case save link, will actually be triggered by any submit button that you put within that form, so both these buttons are in it. If you define one as type button and the other one as type submit, only this button will submit the form. This one will actually, when clicked, trigger this reset form action. So that's something to note. If you want only one button to work, make sure that only one of them is defined as type submit. And so now this page is actually done. Let's reload and see what happens. And it looks pretty good. Although I did mention that I want the form to be more narrow. So I think what we need to do is actually set that in here. And the way I'm going to do this is actually to set this to max width 2XL and leave MX auto so it's centered. And hopefully that does the trick. And it sure does. So I think this looks good. This button could maybe be a little bit darker, so we can fix that too. There, I think that's perfect. So now if I enter a URL and a slug here and hit save, it should create this. Of course, none of this logic actually exists, and you can see that I'm binding to a wire model slug and wire model URL here. But if we open up the create link component, nothing is actually in there. So now the way to complete the create form is to actually set up the entire component. The way I'm going to start with this is the way I usually start. It's just going to be defining the public properties we need at the top. So I've already referenced these inside the template, which is public URL and public slug. And I'm also going to define some rules, which is just within like a protected variable here, protected array. And these are the basic validation rules. By convention, Livewire will actually use whatever rules are defined here, match it by key to the public properties, and then validate if you ask it to based on these rules, which is really cool. And I'll actually demonstrate this below. So for URL, I want it to be required URL and max length of 255. For the slug, I want this to be nullable alpha dash because I don't want any spaces or any weird characters inside the slug. Unique for the links table and the slug column. I don't know if the column should be defined here if it's necessary. I think it's intelligent enough to match this key to the column inside the database, but I'm going to define it anyways. I'm going to make it min of 3, so the length, and also max of 100. So we have those now. I also want to quickly just go ahead and define that reset form method before we jump into the save link method, because I think that's simpler. So what I want to do is just name it reset form. And within here, I want to call this reset, which will reset the values within the public properties to whatever they are just by default, which is empty. And I also want to call this arrow reset validation, because even though we may reset the values inside the public properties, if there is a validation error already present on the UI and we just reset the values within those properties, the validation errors won't actually disappear. So it's really helpful that this method is provided. Now I want to actually define an updated method. This is something also built into the Livewire. So you just pass in a property name. I'm just going to call it property. And you basically just include this validate only here and pass in that property. What will happen is anytime one of these public properties are updated, it'll actually run the validator right away. In our case, because we are binding wire to the model, but with lazy, it'll only validate when the cursor moves away from that text field. It's not going to validate on every keystroke, which is very annoying and also can get quite expensive on the back end, I think, because there's a ton of calls going back and forth. So in my opinion, it's just better to use lazy unless you need extreme precision. So the only method we have left to define here now is save link. And this might get a little bit tricky. Let's just start with the basics. So I'm going to call this arrow validate. This will actually validate using these rules I've defined up here, like I explained before. And then I want to create a link, make sure that model's imported. Create. I want to use the URL we have inside the property, so this URL. For the slug, I want to use either this slug or string random 50, which I'll explain in a moment. And I need to make sure that this is actually imported as well. And lastly, I want to use the user ID of the current user. So I could have created this through the authenticated user, like as a relationship, because authenticated user has a links relationship, but I personally find it better to just link models together using just ID columns if we're already creating them. And so I'm just going to set this to auth user ID. I believe there's a shorthand for this, but I don't remember it. And I need a semicolon here. And I'm going to return redirect to the index route. So links. Okay, so we could actually test it now. So let's try a random string here. And that should complain that that's not a URL, and it sure does. We could put 2 characters in here so it triggers the validator to fail. The slug must be at least 3 characters. If we click reset, it resets everything, which is perfect. If I go in here and do, let's say, google.com, this is a test, and create. There we go. We see a link was created with our custom slug. Let's try to create one with a URL that exists. So this is a test, and we can already see we can't even submit. Actually, it's already validated that the slug has already been taken. So we won't be able to submit that because that slug already exists inside the table. So I've actually just gone ahead and reduced the string random to 20. So let's try creating another one. If I go and just create facebook.com, let's say facebook2.com, create. So it's creating this random slug. Now, the reason I did this, and I don't want to leave it this way, is because this has a pretty decent probability of collision sooner or later. Maybe not if I'm the only user of this URL shortener, but at some point it probably would happen if you have more than one user. If you're interested in kind of knowing some of the math behind this, I would look into the birthday problem. That was really interesting to read about and watch a couple videos about. So the way we solve this is actually by hashing the ID of the link we just created. It's not the prettiest solution because it's actually 2 queries, but If we just save this to link here, use the string random20 just temporarily, and basically just do if not this slug. If this slug is null, we want to update the link, specifically the slug column, to the hash ID. Let's make sure that's imported, of the link's ID, right? So in this case, a hash ID of the link's ID, since IDs increment and there'll only be one ID, this hash ID will always be unique and there won't be collisions. So in this case, if we go now and create this and try again, let's say google3.com and click create, we can now see we have a 6-character hash ID. And if you're interested, that hash ID is 6 characters because we've defined it as a length of 6 in here. We're using the main connection here, and that's why that's working the way it is. So the create page is actually done, believe it or not. It's very simple, but it is done. So if we go to the link test and see if our create test passed now, we'll just try one. Can create link with slug. Let's try this one. And it passes, that's great. So let's try one more just out of curiosity. And it passes too. So that's great. It looks like our create is done. We can now move on to the edit page. So we're going to go through very much like a similar process for the edit page. Although the first thing I want to do is make sure that our edit URL is correct, right? The actual route. Because I noticed in the previous video, we didn't actually include the link ID in here for route model binding, right? So if we include this, we can actually pass that into the controller, which we can go ahead and do now. This should be link and link, and we could pass this like so, with link, link. And now we can go to the edit.blade.php, and we could see it looks almost identical to what the create one looked like before we added all the HTML around it. We're actually going to go and just copy this because it's much simpler and we'll save time. It's almost identical. So I'm going to take this and replace the create component with it. And in here, it's important to also just pass in the link. So you pass in an array as a second parameter. So the key is the name of the variable you want available inside your Livewire component. And then this is the actual thing, the value. Let's refresh here and click again. And now it looks like we have the correct page. Of course, nothing's coming up here because we haven't created a form yet, but at least we know that we have the layout mostly correct. So let's get started on the actual component. And of course, this would be edit link.blade.php. That's the Livewire component. We also want to open up the create link.blade.php. I'm just going to copy this because there is a lot of reusable code in there, and paste that. We do not need the reset button, and we could rename this as save. I'm going to keep calling this save link because it still makes sense in the update context. And we can leave the URL. We can leave the slug because that will be updatable. The one thing I need to add is actually a drop down for the is enabled because I want to be able to toggle that on and off. So what I'm going to do is first create another div to basically just wrap all the HTML elements for the form, and then add the label, the select, and the error parts to it. Okay, so what I've done is actually just created that div wrapper, the label for the enabled. I binded this select to the is_enabled public property. That doesn't actually exist yet, but we'll get to that. I just styled it with block, margin top bottom of 2, width full, rounded, shadow, and then borders and other things that I kind of took from the Breeze package. Although they don't actually include a select drop down, which is interesting to me, but I kind of improvised and made it look sort of similar. And then I just included the error stuff below that, so that should be fine. Now I think if we just reload the page, it might work, and it does. Of course, this button needs to be moved a little bit, and also there's no data coming through because obviously there's no actual component logic built yet, but at least the form renders and it looks half decent. I'm going to fix this button now, and then we could probably move on. Oh, found the issue. Okay, so I didn't actually close this div, and that's why it's not acting correctly on the button there. So the first thing I'm going to do, just like the last time, is actually define the public properties, and I'm going to start with the link ID. I chose to make these camel case, and I'll explain why in a second. So I chose to make these camel case because I know that when I define the rules in here, I kind of want to use this built-in functionality because I think it's really a clean way of validating within a Livewire component. But I'm pretty sure the keys need to match the names of the public properties almost exactly, I would think. So I want to make them both camel case just to make sure that there's no issues there. I'm not sure if this really badly breaks the convention of Livewire or Laravel, but it's not my favorite thing to do. Okay, so those are the rules. I'm just going to go ahead and define that same updated method for validation. I'm going to define a mount method. So if you're not familiar with what mount is in the component lifecycle, I would very much recommend checking out the Livewire documentation for that. But basically this method is called when the component is mounted, so early on in the lifecycle. And this is very good for us because this is where the link is passed in that I passed in through the edit link, through the edit.blade.php file right here. So that's where this enters the component. And within here, we could actually assign the different properties. So this link ID is equal to link ID. This URL is equal to, link URL. This slug is equal to link slug. Now, the alternative to this is actually just creating a link up here and assigning this arrow link to link. I prefer splitting it up because it's just cleaner in the template side to have separate properties for each different column within the link model. It's just a personal preference. It would be cleaner inside the component itself to not have this split up separately, but I actually like doing it this way. Okay, so that's our mounted method. Now our data should be set using the passed in link. And now we can actually go ahead and, well, actually before we do that, maybe we could actually see the data pop up within the form. And we sure do. So this link is actually enabled. If I refresh, it's still enabled, even if I set no, obviously. So it's loading the data correctly. And these are also the correct data coming from the columns of that link. And so we can actually just finish this up by defining that save link method. And in here, I'm just going to query for the link. So link find or fail this link ID. For those of you wondering, you can't really set a model to a public property from what I understand. And so I think the best way is to actually query in the save method, though I'm not 100% sure. This is typically how I build Livewire stuff, and it's worked for me great. So I'm going to keep doing it this way. Within here, I'm just going to pass in this validate. This will actually return the validated array of data. So it'll update just using that array. No need to overcomplicate things because we've already done so up here. And so right here, I'll return a redirect to the index route, which is just links. And from here, we just need to add one more check. And we basically need to check that the slug that's passed in is unique against every single other link in the database other than its own. So if a user is updating a link and they're submitting the same slug that the link already has saved in the database, that should be fine. But if the user updates the slug to something that's already existing in the database, then that can't be allowed. So what we need to do is basically check for uniqueness except for our own link. So let's make a method that acts sort of like a custom validator. And I'm just going to call it in here. So if this check slug exists, we need to return this add error, which is built into Livewire for the slug. And that error should read, this slug is already taken. And this is a very handy little tool that comes with Livewire. You can just append to the error bag on your own, so you don't need to rely on their validation that's provided with Livewire. This is really cool. And in here, we can define a method that's very simple. So check slug exists. And within here, we can just query for a link where the slug is equal to this slug first. And we return if the link exists and the link ID does not equal this link ID. So if the link exists and the link is not the link that we're currently editing, that means that there is a collision and we can't allow that slug to be saved. And that's when we add the error here to the slug. That's the key. With the error, this slug is already taken. So if I go back to the page now, actually let's go to the dashboard. Let's grab this slug here. Let's edit this one and try to save it with this. This slug is already taken. Perfect. So that won't be allowed. But if we just try our own custom one and save, it'll actually update to that. We can actually even update the URL, and that works. And we can set this to disabled, and you can see it says inactive here. So everything works perfectly. Now let's also try this here. If we go here, notice that redirects is currently 0. If we redirect to this, oh, we can't because it's actually disabled. If we try this one, for example, which is also redirect 0, let's try to redirect to this. It'll take us to facebook2.com, which obviously doesn't exist, but you can see that redirects went up, which is awesome. So the next step for me outside of this video series would actually be just making this like a dynamic data table like you'd see in one of my previous tutorials. I've actually done 2 on data tables, I think, and that'd be a fun project. I'd also would like to add like a search or something and maybe extend the tracking of redirects, but that's like a later project. I think for now this would be a great replacement to the to my current URL shortener, and I'm going to deploy this and use it. I think it'd be fine. If you have any questions, please leave them down below. Right before I end, I'd actually like to run the entire test suite. Fingers crossed, I hope everything passes. Oh, looks like we have 1 failure. Can update link. Let's see what's happening there. Okay, so it says that it's trying to assert true here, but it's not asserting true. So I know for a fact that this link has an is enabled column. So let's see what this link actually shows. If we run this test here, DD it out, and it looks like that column's actually not showing up. So my thinking is that the factory is not correct. Link factory, and it's not there. So if we just include is enabled here and set it by default to true because it defaults that way in the database, and save this and rerun tests, looks like all tests pass. So that's great. So that's it for this series. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something from it. It was actually very difficult to get everything pieced together, but I'm starting to get used to the whole YouTube thing. So if you found this useful, have any questions, any criticisms, leave them below. PRs are welcome to this project if you really want to add to it and use it for yourself. It'll be available, and the GitHub link is in the description below. As always, subscribing is the best way to support this channel. I do plan on making more videos. I find this to be a lot of fun. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.